Okay, so we discussed who are God's people. That is the question we started with tonight, and we discussed that off camera. But I want you guys to think about who are God's people. What do you think? With that, I want to talk about recent statistics on today's religions. So here, I'm going to show you a couple different charts. So here's a circle pie chart here of the religions of the world today from 2020. And as you can see, Christianity has the most people. 32.2% of people who are religious are Christians. Next is Islam, and there's the charts I'm going to show you are actually different statistics, so keep that in mind as we look at this. And then Hinduism is next. And Hinduism is the last remaining famous polytheistic religion, so they worship many different gods. And then you have non-religious, and some other studies put this number higher, but this one puts it there. And if you notice, where's Judaism on here? You can see it, 0.2. There's barely any people are Jewish. On this chart, you can see what's called ethnic religions. And so I want to explain what that means. So an ethnic religion is a religion that's based on your family and your bloodline. Specifically. So it's where you're born is also your religion. And I say that because, number one, Hinduism is an ethnic religion. So originally, all Hindus were Indians. There were people that were born in India and that worship these gods and have these traditions of Hinduism. But today, it has become a more universal religion. And so a universal religion is a religion that anyone, it doesn't matter where you're born, can be a part of this religion. And Hinduism has become more universal, but originally, and also today in the extremists, there are some extreme Hindus that believe you cannot be Hindu unless you are Indian, because you're born into it. It's how it is. And so I mention that because it's significant for understanding the difference between Christianity and Judaism, because Judaism in its origins was an ethnic religion. You were born into this country and this place, and you were born into this. Whereas Christianity, you can be born Christian in the sense that maybe your country's dominated by Christianity or something, but Christianity is a universal religion. It's not something you're born into that's connected to a unique family history or bloodline. So with that, here's another chart. Percentage of world religions. You can see once again, Christianity is at the top, then Islam, and then unaffiliated, in this one, is actually above Hinduism. So in some records, being an atheist or being just non-religious, secular, is actually more people than Hinduism. And then you have Buddhism, which came from Hinduism. Buddhism is to Hinduism what Christianity is to Judaism. And then here's one more. This one is a bar graph. And as you can see, Christianity is the #1 religion in the world. So today, 1/3 of the world is Christian. And I'm not talking about Christian in the sense of a true Christian, a genuine follower from the heart of Jesus, but in the sense of the culture and people, if they were asked, what do you believe? They'd say, oh, I'm a Christian. 1/3 of the entire world. That's a lot of Christians today. So Christianity is the most popular and dominant religion. Judaism is one of the least religions in the world. Judaism is now a minority religion. Yet Christianity came from the Jews. And so I just want you to think about that, how crazy that is. So what does it mean to be a Jew? That is my first question here. And so does anyone want to give thoughts on that?
Now that Israel's a country, they kind of split off a little bit because some people are Israeli, but they are not Jewish. Whereas that identity didn't really exist before that, as far as I'm aware. But also it's passed down by the mother. So if you have a Jewish father but you don't have a Jewish mother, you're not passed down, like you don't count. That would possibly affect the number as well, I would think. So your mother has to be Jewish, and then I don't know, would you be considered a Jew if your mother was Jewish but you didn't follow? I don't know what you would call that.
It actually depends on the tradition. But yeah, the popular view is that your mother has to be Jewish.
Right. Yeah, so they would follow, I guess, Shem. Right? The name. I mean, there's kind of a culture around being a Jew too.
Yeah, absolutely.
They have their own culture, and not just, so it's mainly you follow rabbis basically. There's also a very group mentality that they have, and they tend to find each other. They congregate, they find each other, and they create little communities. They're isolated, but usually not from each other. Usually they'll find each other. So I'd argue that being part of that group is just as important as your mother being Jewish, because that's really what makes you one of them. You're in the group.
Absolutely. Great thoughts. So the next question is, what does it mean to be a Christian?
What it means to be a Christian is walking with God all the time. Everything you do is for God and believing in Jesus. A lot of people are they may be against so much. Like I know some Christians who are against their kids watching horror films because it's like God doesn't want you to have those kind of thoughts in your head and stuff like that. And so I feel like it means purity to me. I feel like that's what it means to be a Christian, that you're just pure and you want to walk with God, be on this path of like righteousness with him.
Okay, and so with those two thoughts, what does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be a Christian? I want to return to who are God's people. And I would answer this as both Jews and Christians are God's people. And someone had said earlier off camera, Cara actually, which was a brilliant answer, that all people are God's people. And in the sense that God created all people and God loves all people and the whole earth belongs to the Lord and we all come from one man named Adam. That's true in that sense. However, in the way the Bible talks about it, there's a separation between God's people, those who truly believe in him and follow him, and those who go against God and get lost in the world. And so in that sense, there is a distinction between some people who are not God's people based on that and those who are God's people in the Bible. But according to the Bible, you can strongly make the argument that both Jews and Christians are God's people. So with that, this is why we are going into the recent history of God's people. This is going to be part 1 of 2 tonight. We're going to start by talking about the tragedy of the Nazarenes and the church in history, from Rome, where it began, to America, which is going to cover the years 50 to the present day. First of all, here's an overview of what we're going to be talking about tonight and next week. So tonight, we're going to talk about how Jewish and church history overlap. The first 500 years of church history is also very important Jewish history. So we're going to talk about that tonight. And then we're going to transition from there to show how it separates and becomes church history. And we'll cover the rest of church history up to the present day tonight as well. And then next week, we're going to cover the remaining 1500 years of Jewish history separate from church history using 3 different periods: the Roman period, the medieval period, and the modern period. And this is going to be only the highlights of everything. But we're covering 2,000 years. I'm going to go as fast as I can, but it's a lot. I'm trying to do the highlights of things. One more question before we jump into the material. And the question is, who killed Jesus? Who killed Jesus? What do you guys think? Thank you, Michael.
I mean, I would argue all of us did. The Bible says the Jewish people killed him. They betrayed him. The Jewish leaders specifically, they specifically were out to get him, but the Romans are the ones that actually physically killed him. Pilate is said to be guilty because he had the power to save Jesus, and he decided to wash his hands of it, but that didn't really work. His wife had a nightmare, and she warned him to stay away from Jesus, and he didn't. So, yeah, so I think the answer is all of us.
Yeah, you nailed it. Next, with that, true or false? What do you guys think? The Jews rejected Jesus. False, the Jews rejected Jesus is what I say. That is an overgeneralization. What's true is that the majority of Jewish leadership rejected Jesus. That's an important distinction. So with that, we're launching into the tragedy of the Nazarenes. And this is the beginning of both Jewish and Christian history from the end of the Second Temple, and it's going to cover how the Nazarenes end up being double persecuted by 2 different groups, which is really, really sad. It's a severe tragedy. And so the years we're going to cover are from 30, which is when Jesus ascended into heaven. He rose from the dead and he ascended into heaven. The beginning of the Nazarenes until they go extinct by 400. So remember that Nazarene is specifically a term for Jewish believers in Jesus. They were still Jewish. They still practiced Jewish customs. They still got circumcised. They didn't believe that you had to do those things to be saved. And that's an important thing to understand. But they did these things because it was part of being Jewish and just part of the expression of their faith. Christian refers to Greek or Gentile believers in Jesus. So there's a difference there. The Way, which was called the Nazarenes, I talked about this in the book of Acts, how Nazarenes was what they were called by outsiders, kind of like Mormons are called Mormons. But Mormons call themselves LDS. And in the same way, Nazarenes called themselves followers of the Way. The first 14 years of Christian history, quote unquote, was only Jews who accepted Jesus as their Messiah. And this is from the years 30 to 44. And during this time, if you wanted to follow Jesus, you needed to join the Jewish community. That's just how it was. Until God brought that revelation that you did not have to be Jewish to follow Jesus. It was a big deal. So we'll start with the beginning. The Nazarenes were in Jerusalem and Judea. After Peter's Pentecost sermon that we talked about in the book of Acts, there were 3,120 Nazarenes, and it says this number was growing every day. These Nazarenes worshipped alongside all of the Jews in Jerusalem. They regularly went into the second temple for worship. There was a problem, though, and that's that Jesus, who Nazarenes believed was the Messiah, was crucified as a convicted terrorist against Rome. Didn't look so good to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. In the Jewish and Roman leadership over Judea, there were two responses to this reality. The first response was to tolerate the Nazarenes as a temporary heresy. Certain Jewish leaders said they're just fools. They think that this crucified guy is the Messiah. It'll die off in time. Just let it go. And they tolerated the Nazarenes. They let them be among the Jewish people and accepted them, but rejected that foolish idea and kind of mocked them. That's probably where the term Nazarene came from. And then they just let it go from there. But the other response was more one of anger and wanting to suppress and destroy this movement. And they wanted to imprison and kill the Nazarenes. Saul was one of the ones who was originally part of this before he became Paul. And there were two outcomes based on this: the persecution of Nazarenes, which led to them scattering from Jerusalem, and the tolerance and Nazarenes staying in Jerusalem at different times. But everything changed during this period called the Three Jewish-Roman Wars, which lasted from the years 66 to 136. And so it began with the First Jewish-Roman War, which was from 66 to 73. And what happened in the context of this is that Jesus had actually made this prophecy that doesn't get talked about a whole lot, but it was very significant back then. Remember how Jeremiah in the Old Testament had said that the Babylonians were going to come and destroy the temple, the first temple, right? Well, Jesus had said that the Romans were going to come and destroy the second temple. It's in the Bible. It's in the New Testament. You can see it. The problem is that Christians are sometimes so focused on different views of the end times, they miss it. But it's very clear that Jesus is making this prophecy. So the Nazarenes were expecting this because they believed this is a prophecy. This is going to happen. So when things start escalating with the Romans and the Romans start surrounding Jerusalem, things are happening, the Nazarenes start running away from the city because they're like, we know what's coming. So the Nazarenes do not support the Jewish leadership in the Roman wars. The Nazarenes run away to Pella in the Decapolis and to the province of Galilee for safety. So in the year 70, the Romans win this first war, destroying both Jerusalem and the second temple in the process. And around this time, the Romans changed the name of the Jewish homeland from Judea to Palestine because they wanted to separate the idea that this was a Jewish land. They're like, no, this is a Roman land. It's connected with the Philistines because in the Roman language, Palestine sounds like Philistines. They wanted to remove Jewish influence in the land. So that's why they did this. So Jerusalem was renamed Aella Capitolia, and the Romans built a pagan temple to their god Jupiter where Yahweh's temple once stood. Jews were forbidden from entering this new Roman city, and the Jewish people were all forced to leave Jerusalem. However, some Jews were able to set up new settlements for Jewish life in nearby cities around the land of Palestine. So they didn't leave the land completely. Some of them did, but not all of them did. And so the religion of Judaism, because of this, faced a major crisis. The temple was the center of the Jewish faith. It's hard for us to understand that because we have not lived in a time where there is a Jewish temple. But at that time, this temple was the center of everything. This was God's home on earth in the Jewish view. So with it destroyed, the Sadducees, who were in control of the second temple, and they were kind of corrupt. I mean, we talked about that. We talked about the history between the Old and New Testament. The Sadducees quickly went extinct. The Jewish people had to redefine their faith. Some of them came to trust in Jesus as the Messiah and became Nazarenes because of this. However, with no more Sadducees, the two schools of Pharisees, Hillel and Shammai, joined together and became the new leadership of the Jewish people. So the new Jewish leadership of Pharisees became known as sages and rabbis. And rabbi means my great one. They continued to emphasize the importance of Jewish traditions in the oral Torah, or the oral law. So this is not stuff that is written in the Bible. It's stuff that is spoken and just passed down from one rabbi to another. This new Jewish leadership set up their great Sanhedrin, that's the Jewish government or Congress, in the city of Yavne. This is where they finalized the canon of their Bible, called the Tanakh, but what Christians call the Old Testament. In this process of redefining Jewish faith and identity, the rabbis had to decide, what do we do with the Nazarenes? And so like other Jewish people after the First Roman War, the Nazarenes settled around the land of Syria, Palestine, which was formerly the land of Israel. Most initially settled in Galilee and in Pella, but they moved around the Near East from there. By the end of the first century, around 100, the Nazarenes were becoming a minority group as the Gentile Christians began growing much faster in all the lands of the Roman Empire. And as I'm talking about all these dates, the numbers for the dates, keep in mind that this is after Jesus. Some people do the dates as AD, some people do it as CE. The reason I don't do AD, in Christian tradition they usually do AD, is because the idea is that Jesus was born at year 0. That's the reason they came up with the whole thing. But based on studies we have now, Jesus was not born at year 0. Jesus was actually born in BC. How could Jesus be born before Christ? So the point is that this dating system is flawed. It's based on a flawed Catholic tradition. And so I use CE because it's kind of become a more popular thing, but I hope that doesn't offend anyone watching or otherwise. By the end of the 1st century, the Nazarenes were becoming a minority group. And most Nazarenes stayed local to Palestine and preached Jesus to their Jewish brothers and sisters as close to their homeland as possible because they were Jewish and they wanted to be in their homeland. The Nazarenes had literature they circulated among the Jewish people and that also reached the Gentile Christians. This included Bible commentaries. Most Nazarene writings outside the New Testament have been lost, but we do have fragments of their commentary on certain books of the Bible, such as Isaiah. The Nazarenes refused to submit to the traditions and authority of the Pharisees and the rabbis that came from them, and this is one of the things that really distinguished them from other Jews. The Nazarenes proclaimed that Jesus is the Son of God, and all authority belonged to him. They used a Hebrew gospel. It's not really clear what from the things that are written about them, but it may have been the Gospel of Matthew, which was probably originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic, the Jewish language. So the Nazarenes became viewed as traitors against their Jewish nation. They did not help the Jewish leaders fight against the Romans in the First War. They rejected the authority of the rabbis. So before the war, half the Jewish leadership hated the Nazarenes. But now, after this war, all the Jewish leadership hated them. So the rabbis officially rejected the Nazarenes. They developed this prayer ritual or liturgy known as the Amidah. This actually already existed before the time of the Jewish-Roman wars and all that. So it was these prayers that they prayed 3 times every day, morning, afternoon, and evening. Due to the Nazarene problem, the Jewish communities around the land, led by a group of rabbis, and this guy named Rabbi Gamaliel II, who is actually the great-great-grandson of Hillel, and this other guy named Shumel, decided to add a new prayer to the Amidah during the 80s. This new prayer in the Amidah is called the Birkat HaMinim, which means blessing on the heretics. And it is a curse on everyone who is a heretic to Judaism. So this prayer is part of the daily Jewish prayers to this day, but it has been edited in history. Much evidence suggests that this prayer originally included this statement: "May all the Nazarenes be destroyed in a moment." So, just for some perspective here, Rabbi Hillel, who we talked about, who Jesus, when he was 12 years old, saw in the temple and probably talked with Rabbi Hillel, he marveled at Jesus' young wisdom. And many of Rabbi Hillel's teachings went with what Jesus was saying. For example, the golden rule, if you've heard of that. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, Jesus said that. Rabbi Hillel also said that. But then his grandson, Rabbi Gamaliel I, the one who trained Saul, tolerated Jesus. He said, well, the Nazarenes are just fools, but we should tolerate them, not make a big deal out of them. But then his grandson, Gamaliel II, cursed Jesus. So the Nazarenes become official heretics of the new Orthodox Judaism. Nazarenes began to be kicked out of Jewish synagogues. Non-Nazarene Jews were forbidden from associating with Nazarenes. The Jewish oral tradition began circulating some stories about interactions with the Nazarenes. Some of these stories made it into the Talmud, which is the written record of Jewish oral law, and have survived to this day. So today we can see that Jesus the Nazarene is mentioned 10 times in the Talmud, and Nazarenes are mentioned 2 times. There were more references than this, but during the Middle Ages, when Christianity and Judaism were bitter enemies, authorities in both religions censored these passages and probably took many of them out of context. The Talmud treats Jesus as a heretic who is cursed by God. In addition to this, it has 3 stories of Nazarenes in that ancient world. So according to the Talmud, a Roman emperor's nephew named Onkelos wanted to convert to Judaism during the 1st century. Before he made his decision to convert, he was practicing necromancy, which is speaking with the dead, to find out who is the most important in the afterlife. So he's trying to figure out what religion is the true religion. So he's conjuring the dead so he can talk to them and ask, well, in the next world, who's the most important? So he conjures 3 people: the Roman emperor, Titus. This is the guy who destroyed Jerusalem and the Second Temple. The prophet Balaam, who we talked about in the Old Testament, led Israelites astray. And Jesus the Nazarene. And all these people were considered enemies of the Jewish people. All three of these people tell Onkelos that the Jewish people are the most important people in the afterlife, and all three of them face a different eternal judgment that never ends as a consequence for their sins. So this is the passage relating to Jesus from the Talmud. I wanted to read it just to highlight what's in it. So it comes from this place called Gittin, and there's the reference there. So Onkelos then went and raised Jesus the Nazarene from the grave through necromancy. Onkelos said to him, "Who is most important in that world where you are now?" Jesus said to him, "The Jewish people." Onkelos asked him, "Should I then attach myself to them in this world?" Jesus said to him, "Their welfare you shall seek, their misfortune you shall not seek. For anyone who touches them is regarded as if he were touching the apple of his eye." Onkelos said to him, "What is the punishment of that man?" A euphemism for Jesus himself in the next world. Jesus said to him, "He is punished with boiling excrement." It's like poop or sewage. As the Master said, anyone who mocks the words of the sages will be sentenced to boiling excrement. And this was his sin, as he mocked the words of the sages. The Gemara comments, "Come and see the difference between the sinners of Israel and the prophets of the nations of the world. As Balaam, who was a prophet, wished Israel harm, whereas Jesus the Nazarene, who was a Jewish sinner, sought their well-being." There's three takeaways from this. Number one, Jesus sought the well-being of the Jewish people of Israel. He wanted to help them. And the Jewish people recognize this. But he mocked the words of the sages, that's the greatest Jewish rabbis. And so he was condemned as a Jewish sinner and boils in hot poop forever. And so these are the three stories of the Nazarenes in the Talmud. First, according to the Talmud, there was an entire town of Jewish Nazarenes called Kfar Sachania. And in the second story, we read that around 100 to 109 CE, a disciple of Jesus named Jacob of Kfar Sachania taught Rabbi Eliezer, son of Hekanos, a lesson from one of Jesus' many teachings. Rabbi Eliezer was rebuked and disciplined by this other guy named Rabbi Akiva, and remember that name. We're going to talk about him more in a moment. And other Jewish leaders for being tempted by the heresy of Jesus. And finally, the third story from the Talmud, sometime before 135 CE, a famous man in the Jewish leadership named Rabbi Ishmael had a nephew who desperately needed healing, or else he might die. Rabbi Ishmael knew from the Nazarenes that his nephew could be healed in Jesus' name. However, Rabbi Ishmael saw Jesus as an evil heretic against Judaism. For this reason, Rabbi Ishmael preferred for his nephew to die rather than for him to be healed in the name of Jesus. So Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism firmly and completely rejected Jesus. That's what I want you to see from all this. They tried to prevent Jews from following Jesus and being Jewish at the same time. So really, they wanted all the Nazarenes to just become Christians. They're like, please just get out of our land, go join the Christians, live somewhere else, be Gentiles. With this pressure to reject Jesus from the mainstream Jewish leadership, some Nazarenes tried to conform to the rabbinic standards. This already happened even before the Jewish-Roman Wars. Many Jewish believers in Jesus were still convinced that only Jews could follow Jesus. These were the Jews who tried to force the Galatian Christians to get circumcised and convert to Judaism. They're the ones that are called Judaizers. By 100, these Judaizing Jews among the Nazarenes broke off from the original Nazarene group and created a new group called the Ebionites. And so unlike the Nazarenes, the Ebionites rejected the idea that Jesus was the Son of God. They believed he was merely their human Messiah. Also unlike the Nazarenes, Ebionites rejected the Gentile Christians and told Christians that they needed to get circumcised and convert to Judaism if they wanted to truly follow Jesus. These two major doctrinal differences separated the Nazarenes and the Ebionites. Because of their shared culture, geographic region, and support of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, many later Christians would not see any difference between the Nazarenes and the Ebionites. So now we come to the Bar Kochba revolt. So this was the third and final Jewish-Roman war that happened between 132 and 136. So the Jewish people were still furious with the Romans. They did not want to give up and submit to Roman authority. In this context, a great Jewish warrior named Simon appeared to be able to take on the Roman Empire and gain victory for the Jewish people. There's this rabbi named Rabbi Akiva, and he was a Gentile convert to Judaism, so he was actually not born Jewish. He was not Jewish by blood. But he became one of the most influential leaders in early Rabbinic Judaism. He cursed Jesus and those who followed him. According to tradition, he received and helped organize Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism that later inspired magic and occult teachings. We're going to talk about it a bit more next week. So Rabbi Akiva proclaimed that Simon was the Messiah according to his reading of Balaam's prophecy of the rising star from Numbers 24. In Bar Kochba, means son of the star. And so this false Messiah was called son of the star. So led astray by Rabbi Akiva, all the Jewish people who weren't Nazarenes accepted Simon bar Kochba as the promised Messiah. With support from the other Jewish leadership, Rabbi Akiva and bar Kochba tortured and killed all the Nazarenes they could find. The Nazarenes refused to reject Jesus as Israel's true Messiah and remained true to Jesus' command to love your enemies. So they would not fight against the Romans, and they prayed for their Jewish brothers who persecuted them. This finally forced the Nazarenes to separate themselves from their anti-Jesus kinsmen. The leaders of Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism remained in the west near the Mediterranean coast, but the Nazarenes moved east and north to escape persecution from both their fellow Jews and from the angry Roman authorities. At the beginning, Simon bar Kochba's revolt was successful and established a temporary Jewish state that was independent for 3 years. In the end, bar Kochba lost this final Jewish war against the Romans, and he died in battle. The Romans captured and tortured Rabbi Akiva by flaying him, slowly peeling off his skin until he died. Furious with the Jewish people, the Romans sought to paganize the former land of Israel and brought the provinces of Galilee and Samaria, along with the former Judea, into the Roman province of Sierra Palestina, Palestine. Jews were permanently banned from living in Jerusalem. If they ever stepped foot in Jerusalem, the Romans would kill them immediately. Many Jews were taken as slaves into Europe from this time, which is going to begin Jewish communities in Europe. Some were already there, but we'll talk about that more next week. So because of their Jewish heritage, Nazarenes also faced Roman wrath and persecution in the aftermath of the Bar Kochba revolt. Fleeing the Roman persecutions, many Nazarenes moved further north to this place called Beroea Kole'e in Syria. Nazarene settlements remained in this location until they all eventually disappeared amidst the other major changes in Jewish, Christian, and Roman history. By around 150, Nazarenes were no longer welcome inside Jewish synagogues, but Nazarenes had their own small schools and wrote mostly lost commentaries on the Old Testament, which show their beliefs and desire for the Jewish people to reject rabbinic authority and come to Jesus as their Messiah. Nazarenes around the land continued preaching Jesus as Messiah and Son of God to all Jewish people as their brothers and sisters, but they were usually rejected and their numbers slowly began to dwindle. So that's the Jewish side of it. Now let's look at how Christians viewed the Nazarenes. So how did Christians view Nazarenes? So once Paul told Gentiles that they didn't have to convert to Judaism to follow Jesus, Christianity quickly became a Gentile movement. A problem with Gentile cultures is that, like all cultures, they had suspicions and racism toward foreigners who weren't like them. Greek and Roman Gentile cultures were inspired mostly by paganism and Greek philosophy. Paul used these cultural ideas to reach people for Jesus. Some Gentiles in the pagan culture viewed Jews with great suspicion. Some even believed that Jews kidnapped Greeks and regularly practiced child or human sacrifices in their Jerusalem temple. This was before the Second Temple was destroyed. These views can be seen in the ancient writings of the Greek-Egyptian philosopher named Apion. So in Jewish history before the New Testament, many Jews intentionally excluded Greeks and Romans from their social circles. This added to Gentile suspicions toward Jews. Romans would sometimes call Jewish people dogs, and Jewish people had done the same to the Greeks and the Romans. This is best explained by one of the fundamental problems that goes back to the Tower of Babel when God created many languages and culture. Racism, not liking people that are different than you. Other than the original disciples of Jesus and Paul, the early Christians had little contact with the Nazarenes because of their cultural differences. So there were, of course, Jews. The Nazarenes were seen as Jews, and then there were the Christian Gentiles. Greek and Roman Gentiles viewed Jews as part of a foreign culture that they did not fully understand. But early Christians did not view the Nazarenes as heretics. Led by the original disciples who were Nazarenes, all the early Christians celebrated Jesus' death and resurrection every year on Passover, not on Easter. This always happened at the same time other Jews were celebrating God delivering them from slavery in Egypt. Some early Christians wrote that Nazarenes were also called Judaizers, but it is not clear where this came from. Some people think it came from Jesus, like Jesusians, and other people think it came from Jesse. David is the son of Jesse, followers of Jesse, because of the prophecy in Isaiah 11, which is what a lot of Nazarenes used to try to convince Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. Okay, so now we need to talk about this guy named Justin Martyr, because he's really going to change things. Around 100, a Roman citizen from a Greek family named Justin was born in Palestine. He lived among the Jewish people. After studying Socrates, Plato, and others, Justin became a brilliant Greek philosopher. One day, Justin met a Christian and was deeply moved by the testimony of Jesus Christ and the support from the prophets of the Jewish Bible. As a result, Justin became became a Christian philosopher. In 165, Justin was martyred for his faith in Rome. The Romans flogged him and then beheaded him. Because of these things, he became known as Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr was totally immersed in non-Jewish Greek culture. He tried to use philosophy debates to bring people to faith in Jesus. Justin saw Socrates, Plato, and other philosophers as members of the true faith before Christ. Justin was a major figure in the formation of strictly Gentile or Greco-Roman Christianity. As a result, Justin Martyr became the pioneer of a new belief system called replacement theology, also called supersessionism. This belief system is best described in Justin Martyr's famous ancient writing called Dialogue with Trypho the Jew, which is a record of him talking to this Jewish man named Trypho. And here's some quotes from Justin just to show you what the view is. He says, "For the true spiritual Israel and descendants of Judah, Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, who in uncircumcision was approved of and blessed by God on account of his faith and called the father of many nations, are we who have been led to God through this crucified Christ." Then he says, "For the prophetical gifts remain with us," referring to Christians, "even to the present time. And hence you ought to understand that the gifts formerly among your nation, Jews, have been transferred to us, Christians. The marriages of Jacob were types of that which Christ was about to accomplish. For it was not lawful for Jacob to marry two sisters at once. And he serves Laban for one of the daughters. And having been deceived in obtaining the younger, he again served 7 years. Now Leah is your people in synagogue, but Rachel is our church." So if you remember the story, what he's saying is, you guys are the wife that God doesn't love so much, but we're the favorite wife, the church. Next he says, "As therefore Christ is the Israel and the Jacob, even so we who have been quarried out from the bowels of Christ are the true Israelite race." Then he says, "For truly your hand is high to commit evil, because all of you," referring to the Jews, "killed the Christ. But the highest pitch of your wickedness lies in this, that you hate the righteous one and killed him," referring to Jesus, "and so treat those who have received from him all that they are and have, and who are pious, righteous, and humane." This establishes, beginning with Justin, and more people go even more intense. That was just what Justin said, but people say even more intense things related to that. And this is called replacement theology. And in 3 things, this is what it is. Number 1, the Jews killed Jesus. They are Christ killers. Number 2, God has rejected the Jews. Number 3, the church is now God's chosen people, not the Jews. So what does the Bible say to this, to Justin Martyr and these other early Christians that believe this? In Jeremiah 31, "Thus says Yahweh, who gives the sun for light by day and the positions for the moon and the stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. Yahweh of troops is his name. If these positions are removed from my face, declares Yahweh, then the seed of Israel also will cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus says Yahweh, if the heavens above can be measured and the foundations of the earth searched out below, then I also will reject all the seed of Israel for all that they have done, declares Yahweh. And then Paul says in Romans 11, I say then, has God rejected his people? No, never. God has not rejected his people, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So, no. Justin is wrong, and so are all those that were influenced by him. What does history say? For many different reasons and in many different ways, many different Gentiles have tried to kill all the Jewish people. But guess what? They're still here. They're still here. They have survived 4,000 years of brutal human history. So Christianity is this time of the Gentiles, and Jesus talked about this. In Luke, he says, the Jewish people will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And then Paul says, for I do not want you, brothers, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation. He's speaking to Christians. That a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved. That's what the Bible says. But going back to church history after Justin, here's what happens. From around 100 to 300, Nazarenes are treated as Jewish brothers in Jesus, different from Christians, yet pure and equal in the faith. Slowly, Christians begin to remove Jewishness from from Christianity. Christians reject the Bible's Hebrew calendar and stop celebrating Jesus' death and resurrection on Passover, which was the day of Aviv or Nisan 14. Some Christians still celebrated the Passover. They still celebrated Jesus' death and resurrection on Passover, but they were rejected by the mainstream Christians and criticized and even killed for that. And they were known as the 14ers. So they all died off. Eventually, the 14ers are branded as heretics, and all of them die off, but around 190, Irenaeus, who's a very famous Christian writer, defended the 14ers from their Christian critics. So we see that it's still kind of accepted in the early days. So during this period, some Christians recognized the difference between Nazarenes and the Ebionites, who were Judaizers and heretics. So the Ebionites were wrong, but the Nazarenes were true believers in Jesus. The Ebionites are mentioned in early Christian writings as heretics against the true Christian faith, but the Nazarenes are never called heretics during this time. However, by the 200s, Christians like Origen, then Eusebius after him in the 300s, began to confuse the Nazarenes with the Ebionites. They each describe two different types of Ebionites. There's Ebionites who rejected Jesus as the Son of God and required conversion to Judaism, but then they talk about these Ebionites who believe Jesus is the Son of God and share all other major accepted Christian doctrines, except that the second type of Ebionites were categorized as Jewish and not Christian. So then from around 300 to 500, Nazarenes are quickly branded as heretics against the true Orthodox Christianity, and they are persecuted out of existence by Roman Christian authorities. During this time, the Nazarenes would face double persecution, being persecuted by both the Jewish communities and by the leaders of the Christian communities. This began with the confusion of Nazarenes with Ebionites, and then it intensified when Christianity was legalized and then standardized in an Orthodox form with help from Roman Emperor Constantine I by 325. The final nail in the coffin came in the year 380, when Christianity became the only official and legal religion of the Roman Empire under Emperor Theodosius I. So during this time, Jerome, the Christian scholar who translated the entire Bible into Latin, is the last known Christian influencer who might have had any direct contact with the Nazarenes, but we don't know if he had direct contact with them. Jerome somehow knew that Nazarenes still existed in the late 300s, and he knew what they believed. Strangely, Jerome both praises and criticizes the Nazarenes. He admits that their name and followers trace back to the earliest name and source of the Christians, the original Jewish followers of Jesus. Jerome criticizes the Nazarenes for being Jewish, condemning them for living their lives in accordance to Jewish customs based on the law of Moses. Paul says, you do not have to be Jewish or do Moses' law to trust Jesus. And Paul also says, that doesn't save you. Nothing you do saves you. The original understanding is that Gentiles don't have to be Jewish or follow the law of Moses to have a real personal relationship with God. Simple, right? The new Orthodox Christian interpretation of Paul by this time, the end of the first 500 years of Christianity, being Jewish is a sin. You must become a Gentile, throw out your Hebrew calendar, and eat pork to follow Jesus. It's basically the opposite of Judaizing, right? It's Gentilizing. You're trying to force Jews to reject their culture. So one of Jerome's contemporaries, named Philastrius, created a list of all heretics against Orthodox Christian faith. Interestingly, the Nazarenes are not included in this list. On the other hand, the famous heretic list of Christian scholar who is named Epiphanius, also a contemporary of Jerome, does specifically list Nazarenes, separate from the Ebionites, as heretics against the Orthodox Christian faith. For all heretics on his list, Epiphanius describes what each heretic group believed in. When describing the Nazarenes, Epiphanius describes everything that Orthodox Christians believed as part of the true faith. The heresy that Epiphanius put on the Nazarenes was that they remained Jewish. Following Epiphanius, the famous Christian scholar named Augustine and everyone after him only mention the Nazarenes as heretics. They call the Nazarenes heretics with secondhand knowledge based on assumptions and confusions. Augustine thought the Nazarenes were the same as the Symmachians, who he related to the Manichaeans, which was a Gnostic belief system. Augustine was a Manichaean before his conversion to Christianity. Theodoret also confuses the Nazarenes with Ebionites and connects them with Symmachus. The Roman Orthodox Christian Church expected the Nazarenes to abandon being Jewish and become Gentiles if they wanted to follow Jesus. Meanwhile, the leaders of early Rabbinic Judaism had already condemned the Nazarenes as heretics 200 years earlier. The rabbis expected Nazarenes to abandon Jesus, embrace the oral law and the authority of the rabbis, and become Jewish by the rabbis' definition of what it meant to be Jewish. For these reasons, the Nazarenes were persecuted by both fellow Jews and Gentile Christians, so that they all died out probably around the time before 400 CE. By the 500 CE, the Nazarenes are only mentioned in the past tense in church heresy writings. They were extinct. The Nazarenes only lived on as Christian heretics in the records of the Catholic Church, and Jewish heretics in the records of Rabbinic Judaism. All Jewish people who wanted to follow Jesus after this time had to abandon their Jewish culture and become Gentile first before they could be Christians. And even then, sometimes they were not accepted into Christian communities, as we'll talk about next week. This is the tragedy of the Nazarenes and the beginning of the tragic history of Jewish-Christian relations in church history. And so with that, that's the first 500 years of both Christian history and Jewish history. Now we go into just church history for the rest of tonight, and then we finish. So this one is double-sided. I'm just going to read it and make brief comments. Like I said, we're doing only highlights. In the history of Acts, there's 3 names and 3 cities connected with the followers of Jesus as Messiah or Christ. There's the Christians, the Way, and the Nazarenes. There's verses for them. And in Antioch and in Rome, they're called Christians. And in Jerusalem, they are Nazarenes and followers of the Way. The Jerusalem Council happened in the book of Acts, and it was this decision that Gentiles don't need to convert to Judaism for Jesus. But there was a conflict. Jewish Nazarenes, who were a persecuted sect of Judaism, versus the Gentile Christians, who were new. The threat to the Gentile faith in Jesus was the Judaizers. You must convert to Judaism for Jesus, is what Judaizers said. In the 70s, as I discussed, Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews began to scatter in another exile. And then there was this fight for Jewish identity. What is true Judaism? And the Nazarenes were rejected and killed. Then there's this fight for Gentile Christian identity. Can a Jew be a Christian? And so as Gentiles are reading the Bible in this time, it's important to understand that they're reading passages about what would happen to the Jewish people if they rejected or sinned against God in the Old Testament, right? And there's all these curses in the Old Testament if the Jewish people reject God. And so what happens is that they're reading these prophetic judgments from the Old Testament, and they use it to justify pre-existing Gentile racism. And so Jewishness is rejected. They begin to say you can't be both a Jew and a Christian at the same time. Gentiles force cultural abandonment. And the Nazarenes face double persecution and go extinct, except Judaizers, but then they also eventually go extinct. They are the Ebionites that I talked about. Okay, so now Christian communities grow all around the Roman Empire, and Christianity is born. So from 50 to the year 312, 262 years, there's severe Roman persecution on Christians, but it only makes them grow. Only makes them grow. Meanwhile, Christians are theologically divided. Heresy creates a need for a Christian orthodoxy. So what is the right things for a Christian to believe? And there's these 2 major heresies that go in opposite directions. And it all revolves around the idea of how do we talk about Jesus? Is Jesus God? Is Jesus man? How do we talk about that? And so the Arians, and Arianism, they said Jesus was only a man. He was not God, but he is the Christ, the Messiah. Gnosticism said that Jesus was only God. He was never truly a man made of flesh. It just looked like he was a man. He was only God. They established that no, both of these are false. They're 2 extremes. Jesus is both fully God and fully man, as we believe today. So then, in the year 313, there's this new Roman decree called the Edict of Milan, and Christianity becomes legal in the Roman Empire as a result of this. And Emperor Constantine is the one who legalizes Christianity. So now Christians aren't being persecuted anymore, but some Christians who had survived persecution and suffering still were alive during this time. Then there's this event led by Constantine and the other Christian bishops who were leaders called the Council of Nicaea in 325. And this established orthodoxy and confirmed heresy, which was condemned. So this established what is known as the Catholic faith. And the reason it's called Catholic is because the word Catholic means universal. So all Christians will believe this. Then, a couple years after that, within less than 100 years, there's a decree called the Edict of Thessalonica in the year 380. Rome officially becomes a Catholic empire at this time and forces Christianity on everyone with the penalty of death. And so this really is the birth of what's known as Christendom or churchianity. I also call it churchianity. And it's also the birth of what you could call Christian nationalism, if you've ever heard of that term. But it's the idea that we are a Christian nation. You can't be here if you're not a Christian. We're going to kill you if you're not a Christian. The idea of taking a sword and putting it to somebody and say, accept Jesus or die. And they actually did that around this time. They went around to the pagans and said, accept Jesus or die, and they would kill people who rejected Jesus. So look at that shift. The Christians go from being the persecuted to the persecutors. So from 381 to 476, 95 years, the Catholic Church, led by the Bishop of Rome, who comes to be called the Pope, which means father, becomes the last unifying strength of the rapidly declining Roman Empire. Rome falls to outside European invaders. And there's kind of a debate, did Rome really fall? We'll talk about it a little more next week. For now, in the West, Rome falls. 476 to 1517, a period of 1,041 years. This is now the Middle Ages or medieval times. As the modern nations of Europe are slowly developed out of the ashes of the Western Roman Empire, the Catholic Church remained the only unifying and supreme source of authority in every land and kingdom. You could think of the Catholic Church kind of like the federal government. They're there like everywhere. So there's chaos everywhere. It was like the Wild West in many ways. It was very hard to survive in that time. You would not have wanted to live through it. But the church was like that one beacon of like light and safety. So Christians fight to kill each other for political power in the name of the same God. And so you see there's still divisions among the people, right? There's people of this race. There's the French and the Germans and well, actually at this time there weren't French and Germans yet, but you get the point. There's these different, the English, and then there's Viking invaders, and they become Christians, but they all still have their own background. They're like, well, we're different than them. And so as a result, Christians go to war with each other, and they just fight in the name of God, each of them hoping that they're the more righteous ones so that they can win the war. Meanwhile, Jews all over Europe were branded Christ killers and persecuted everywhere with idiotic, racist myths. Jews found the greatest safety in Spain until 1492, in Germany until 1933. The Catholic Church became disgustingly corrupt, integrating pagan myths into their teachings, promising entrance to heaven for money, forbidding Christians from reading Bibles in their own languages. So the Catholics start forcing people to read or listen to Jerome's outdated and foreign Latin Vulgate translation. So what Jerome did, I mentioned that earlier. In Jerome's time, the Bible was in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. But guess what? By his time, Latin was the common language. Most people, especially in the West, they didn't know Greek or Hebrew, these other languages. So they're like, we need a translation so people can understand the Bible. So he translates it into Latin, called the Latin Vulgate, because Vulgate means common language. But then guess what happens? It becomes sacred. So they make it, you have to read this Latin Bible or else we'll kill you if you don't. And people were killed for being caught reading the Bible in their own language. And so they were, in addition to this, killing anyone who translated the Bible into a common language, killing anyone who went against the Pope and Catholic authority, and worshiping beings other than the one true God, such as Mary and the saints. And if not worshiping them, they were at least praying to them, which in my view is kind of the same thing. So then there's the horrific Black Plague in the 1300s, as you can see here. It slowly made the majority of European political powers lose faith in the Catholic Church, combining with the rest of these events to remove the Catholic Church's credibility as Christ's representative. Then there's this event known as the Great Schism in 1054 CE. So due to a disagreement about how to describe the Trinity, and also to a disagreement about how much authority the Pope had, because the Pope at one point was considered first among equals. There were other Christian leaders in other cities who were like equal to the Pope, but the Pope was considered like, I'm the first because I'm descended from Peter. That's how they thought about it. But then there's this idea that the Pope is greater than all these others, and so that was also part of this conflict. But also the official reason that they cited is that, oh, well, you described the Trinity the wrong way. And so because of that, the United Catholic Church splits into two halves: the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East.
What's the Trinity difference between the two?
So the Roman Catholics said that the Holy Spirit comes from God the Father and God the Son. The Eastern Orthodox said the Holy Spirit comes from the Father only. because of that. So, well, honestly, there were politics involved. So like the Pope was like, I'm greater than all you, and that was a big part of this too. And the Eastern Orthodox are like, no, we have authority too. So they split. So then there's the Protestant Reformation in 1517 CE, 506 years ago. Christians in Europe began to openly reject the Catholic Church's authority with support from powerful political forces that were developing. Their goal was to reform the church. So the goal of the Protestant Reformation was not to destroy the Catholic Church. So it's important to understand that. It was really just to make the Catholic Church pure, to purify the Catholic Church. That was the idea originally, but then it just kept getting crazier from there. So in time, every country in Europe divided based on whether they were predominantly Catholic or Protestant, meaning you protested the established Catholic Church. However, this allowed Christians to seek the truth about their faith as the Bible was finally translated into the common languages of modern Europe. So here's when the Bible begins being translated into English, into German, into French, into Spanish, and other languages. So from 1518 to present, 504 years, Protestant denominations multiplied as new Christians challenged the old ways of the established church. And so what happens is that within the Reformation, right, there's some churches that they're like, okay, we're reformed now. But then there's Christians within that movement that is like, no, you're not. You're corrupt here, you're corrupt here, you're corrupt here. We need to reform this again. And so they do a new Reformation, and that becomes a new denomination. And so that just keeps happening. So Christianity splits again and again in countless new denominations. Today, around 45,000 Christian denominations exist, although this may be an exaggeration. It's hard to get an exact figure, but there are a ton. I'll link to the video description below that goes through the details of the major Christian denominations of today. We don't actually even know all of them. That's how many Christian denominations there are today. Meanwhile, Protestants and Catholics continued warring to kill each other for around 200 years. Many Catholics and Protestants still condemn each other today. Now I'm narrowing down on our experience based on my personal background and what I know you guys are familiar with when we think about Christianity in America. So to do that, we have to talk about the Puritans, and that goes from 1620 to the present. So discontent with the continued corruption of the Anglican Church of England, which in America it's called Episcopalian. So discontent with the continued corruption of the Anglican Church in England, the Puritans left their homeland behind and sailed for the colonies in America for religious freedom. They sought to purify the church, hence the name Puritans, of all corruption, though they were often bound in legalism and cruelty. Originally influenced by French theologian John Calvin, the Puritan form of Christianity built the foundation of Baptist and evangelical Christianity in America today. Jonathan Edwards, called the greatest American theologian of all time, was a Puritan. Their views are most commonly found in preachers such as John MacArthur of Grace Community Church. And so as a side note here, I have to mention the Quakers, because the Quakers were these really awesome Christians who also ran away to America to be accepted and have religious freedom. And the Quakers believed that you could hear from God directly and really emphasized a personal relationship with God and intimacy with Him for all people. But the Puritans rejected the Quakers and persecuted them. In fact, in one instance, Puritans burned a Quaker at the stake, like burned him alive, which is what the Catholics had been doing to Protestants and then to heretics before that. And sometimes in church history, a heretic was just somebody that the Catholics didn't like. Like they may have been a true believer, burned at the stake. And actually, there's a book called Fox's Book of Martyrs, good book, and they register famous Christian martyrs as true Christians who were killed by the Catholic Church. Okay, so now we talk about Pentecostals and Charismatics. So this is more my personal background in Michael days as well. So this started from 1906 to present, and beginning with some smaller events in Europe and kicking off with the Azusa Street Revival, which happened between 1906 to 1915, many Christians still saw corruption, deadness, and a lack of authenticity in the church. Looking to the New Testament book of Acts, they sought baptism in the Holy Spirit with signs such as speaking in tongues. Many experienced miracles and were forever changed, but others condemned this movement and its offshoot denominations due to some controversy with some of their leaders, because there have been some crazy controversies in the Pentecostal and Charismatic movement, sadly. But there have been in all of church history, as I hope you can see. In 1927, a woman named Amy Semple McPherson led a movement inspired by this brand of Christianity that created the Foursquare Church. My parents came to Jesus through this denomination. Along with many from Puritan backgrounds and other related backgrounds, the Foursquare Church embraced the Jewish people as chosen by God forever. By the time the Protestants came around, not at first, but as they were challenging old ideas, they started to to realize, wait a minute, we need to take the Bible literally. It's not a metaphor. Israel is not a metaphor for the church. Israel is Israel. The Jews are the Jews. They are God's people with us. So that idea begins to be accepted, not just in the background I came from, but many other backgrounds as well. And so this is regardless of whether or not Jews reject Jesus. So the background I came from and other Christian backgrounds, a lot of Puritan backgrounds, would say that Israel, the Jewish people, are still God's people. Doesn't matter whether they reject Jesus, they're still God's chosen people, and we are joined into them, as Michael was saying at the beginning. And we'll talk about that more 2 weeks from tonight. And so finally, you have the Jesus movement. And when we saw the movie, The Jesus Revolution, if any of you saw that movie, it really focuses on the beginning of the Jesus movement. That's what it's talking about. And it was out of the Jesus movement that arose the official new type of Judaism that's called Messianic Judaism. There were earlier origins before that, but I'll talk about that next week because that's part of Jewish history. The Jesus movement and Messianic Judaism began in 1967 to the present. Some Christians begin to accept and support the idea that Jews can trust Jesus as Messiah without rejecting Judaism, as it was with the Nazarenes. So in a way, this is the resurrecting of the Nazarenes in Messianic Jews today. And finally, there's my experiences, which I have headed here as anti-denominationalism and anti-church Christianity. I'm not going to talk about that tonight because this is already a really long message, obviously. We're going to devote 2 nights to that at the very end here. And so we already talked about what does it mean to be a Christian? That's the question at the bottom here. And then you can see there's some verses here. We're going to discuss Matthew 16, the church in the Bible, which is ecclesia in Greek, and there's all these other verses there. So we're going to talk about that 2 weeks from tonight because there's just way too much to cover in this. But the point of all these things that we're talking about is to get you thinking about how both the Jews and the Christians are God's people, and how do we think about that today? What does the Bible have to say about that? We're going to specifically read a ton of verses to really explore this in depth 2 weeks from tonight. But next week, we're going to focus on Jewish history to understand what the Jewish people went through as a result of the church's corruption. And that's also going to talk about how the Jewish people were never abandoned by Jesus, despite the fact that the church abandoned them. So God, I thank you for your faithfulness, and I ask that you would help us to see the truth in all these things we've been talking about. In Jesus' name, amen.